Did you have nightmares about birds?
Who wouldn't? No, I didn't have nightmares
I
about birds.
mostly just have nightmares about living my normal life.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Watch No Evil. This is Matt.
And this is Zach.
And continuing along with our Alfred Hitchcock Presents Hour, we are going to start talking about The Birds, a classic Hitchcock film in which a California town is besought upon by flocks of various and bloodthirsty birds. I think that we talked about this last night, but I think that the weakest thing about this movie, really, in my opinion, is the ending. What did you think?
Oh, you think that's the weakest part?
I really do.
I remember it ending and being like, that's it? Because I had seen this when I was younger, and I do not remember much about it other than, the birds part that everyone remembers. And I do not remember ending that way. It's almost like they wanted to do a cliffhanger, but it was not a good cliffhanger. I think it was meant to be open-ended. I would have enjoyed the ending much more if it had ended with, after they had boarded up the Brenner house, and then they're just sitting in the living room, and there's that moment where you hear the birds start to accumulate outside, and they start making all this bird noise, and you hear them coming. If it had just roll end credits at that moment, I feel like that would have been a way better cliffhanger ending. As the birds, they're still there, they're still a problem, and they're about to deal with it, instead of this quasi-resolution at the end.
Right. All right, I have a question for you. Would you consider this an apocalyptic movie? Or would you consider the bird's sort of transformation an apocalyptic event?
I wouldn't say apocalyptic. Apocalyptic is like world ending as we know it. I think it's more of like a natural disaster kind of situation. I don't think it's this thing that's going to change life and the world as we know it.
For sure. Yeah, I understand that. There's this idea, I think, in movies that, especially I would say apocalyptic movies, where they don't want you to become comfortable with how it ends, because then it sort of takes away some of the magic of the scenario that they've created. And this is another example of a movie where it wants to not give you a happy ending. I think about zombie movies. How many zombie movies at the end do they find a cure that they know is going to work? Like World War Z, where they find a cure at the end, and it's just like, oh, okay, that's fine. And in this movie, they are not giving a strong resolution, and there are plenty of other movies that don't give you strong resolutions. I would say like Stephen King's The Mist doesn't give you a particularly happy ending. It doesn't give you a particularly happy resolution, although the book forms is even more mysterious in that regard. I think about like Little Shop of Horrors, the original one, not the movie, where in the original one the Audrey 2 plant creature continues to grow, and I believe there's a little narration at the end that indicates that they are slowly consuming the planet. The thing that I'm thankful for with this movie is that they didn't try to close it out with some sort of narration, because it wouldn't necessarily have fit with the structure of the movie. They didn't need to tell you, and the birds would go on to haunt the 50 states of the U.S. and blah, 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 and destroying, etc., and this, It's not like a plague movie where we get to sort of see it happen. It really still maintains this level of Hitchcock intimacy where he still keeps everything relatively close, in that he's able to create more fleshed out characters. But this ending, I think it was a little abrupt in a weird way. And I think that you're right. Something that would have indicated that the birds were still sort of active, or were maybe even growing in their aggressiveness, would have been more satisfying than having them sort of like walk out and be outside the house and all of the birds are just sort of like sitting or walking around and they're very non-aggressive. That gave me the opposite impression. That gave me the sense that they were calming down. And I know that there were periods of calm for the birds in the rest of the movie, but it sort of undid a lot of the progress that the movie built in a way that I wasn't totally satisfied with.
Honestly, I felt like a lot of time in the middle of the movie was just wasted. They put too much time into character development. By an hour and a half in, you're like, okay, I'm pretty sure I know what these characters are about. Towards the end was like more of what people wanted to see and what I wanted to see. Because we did have that moment in the house, like I mentioned, and there's that really tense moment where they're all just sitting in the living room and it's silent and you hear the birds coming and you hear the pounding start and it's this really great, tense horror thriller moment. And then I also kind of like that whole car shuffle at the end where they're all just sitting outside and Mitch is tiptoeing around them and trying to get the car ready. And I like the tenseness of that scene. I just felt it should have been earlier in the movie. It shouldn't have been how the movie
it belonged
ended.
way earlier.
It was a great scene. It just shouldn't have been at the very end of the movie. I just read the short story earlier today. Mm-hmm. The abrupt ending is supposed to be a nod to the short story that this is based off of. The short story by Daphne du Maurier was written, I think, 9 years before this movie came out. And a lot of differences between the story and the movie, but the story ends kind of abruptly where it's like there's no resolution, but there is this sign. The main character, he's a smoker, and their family, they had just gotten a new bunch of supplies, and he goes, oh, I forgot to get cigarettes, but I'll smoke this last one. And he like throws the empty packet of cigarettes into the fire. And it's kind of like a sign of resignation almost. So you can kind of see where it's going to go. Mm-hmm. Rather than this, it's like, so are they going to find a hospital or like what's... It's in this weird limbo between is it resolution or is it a cliffhanger? I want it at least to lean to one side.
Yeah, I would agree. It doesn't feel satisfyingly concluded. We're still waiting for something to happen, and I think that there is a wonderful validity to having a piece like this not end in a way that is happy or satisfying or overdramatic or anticlimactic. And so all you have is what really feels like not even the climax yet. Unless, of course, you consider the car explosion, fire, and the scene inside of the telephone booth the climax. But this ending, it just doesn't seem like it stuck to a lane.
Whether you view the ending as a resolution or ominous ending, I guess it depends on why you think the birds are even there and why they're even a problem. And I think that we should get into that. The one lady at the restaurant does seem to blame Melanie. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that's supposed to be almost a humorous kind of thing or just like a...
I think you're the cause of this. I think you're evil. Like as if it's some sort of moral judgment.
Because she's from the city and everyone else is from their little town. It's just this weird thing. And you kind of get... Like, I got the impression that it was Melanie and Mitch's relationship that was kind of the cause of it. I think that's supposed to be what's going on because there are birds always present from the moment that they meet in the pet store to the very end of the movie. There's always birds around them. I think they're supposed to be represented by the lovebirds because they do develop this romantic relationship throughout the plot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's sort of a juxtaposition or a correlation between love and violence in this movie, specifically because the lovebirds, and especially the birds at the beginning when they're talking about the lovebirds, there's sort of this underlying tension between Melanie and Mitch. Mm-hmm. They have this sort of romantic tension and it all revolves around the lovebirds. And it continues through the whole movie. And I think that that's why at the end, little Kathy still asks Mitch if she can go get and bring the lovebirds along.
And the lovebirds are the one group of birds that are not violent.
Right. And we don't necessarily know if they're not violent because we don't ever get to really see them. They're stuck in the cage. It could also be an issue of they're domesticated.
Ooh.
That could be something that's part of it. And I think that's supposed to sort of represent this way in which the lovebirds are symbolic of Mitch's relationships in the movie, because his entire character is sort of defined by his relationships to the women. So his mother, Lydia, plays a significant role in his personality and his upbringing, his interactions with Melanie, his interactions with his younger sister, Kathy, and his interactions and history that we get to learn with Annie Hayworth, who is played by Suzanne Pleshette. At least the mother, the sister, and Melanie all interact with the lovebirds on their own as well. If you think about it, Kathy is really excited about the lovebirds. Mitch is sort of indifferent and sort of tense about them, which is sort of the tension of his relationship with Melanie. And then the mother basically rejects them. She doesn't like that they're there. One, because they're a gift from Melanie, and two, because she's afraid of the birds at large, just like she is afraid of a developing relationship with her son, which is why his relationship with Annie Hayworth failed in the past.
Right.
So they're sort of representative of those relationships.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And the fact that they hear on the radio that the bird attacks are centered around Bodega Bay, where they are.
Mm-hmm.
It's not necessarily Melanie's relationship with Mitch. It's just like Melanie's presence that seems to be the reasoning behind the presence of the birds.
And as far as we know, trouble follows Melanie Daniels. From the window breaking incident that Mitch saw her in court for, to the skinny dipping in the fountain in Rome, there's this whole idea that trouble follows her, and now it's sort of reached this point where it's sort of supernatural trouble, something that she really has no control of or no participation in, but it's what is causing the issues at large.
The disastrous nature of the bird issue is somewhat of a companion to Melanie and Mitch's relationship as a whole because of how they meet. They first see each other in court, but then they meet when Melanie is pulling one of her pranks. She's pretending to be the pet store worker when she's really not, and she's kind of like misleading Mitch in that moment, but he also knows, he's also kind of manipulating her at that same time because he knows who she is. So there's this weird unspoken thing in the beginning, and they're both trying to manipulate each other. Then she starts stalking him to pull this elaborate quote-unquote prank with the lovebirds. I think that she is just, I like this guy, so I'm gonna follow him and give him these lovebirds that he wanted. It's like this weird manipulative start to this relationship, and if any relationship started this way, there's no way that it would work out okay. It's almost like the doomed nature of that relationship is paralleled by the whole bird uprising.
It's interesting, too, because there's sort of a poetic justice to the bird uprising as well, because the first time that we meet both Mitch and Melanie, they are in a pet store and they're focusing on these birds, and specifically all of these caged birds. And then what happens is the scenario flips, and because they're trapped in this house, they sort of become the caged ones. So there's this hilarious irony to it.
Yeah, that's why I said ooh earlier, because you're talking about how the lovebirds were in a cage the whole movie. Mm-hmm. I was thinking of when they did board up their house and they had the lovebirds in the cage inside the larger cage that was the house, with people inside who have become the birds. So it's this really meta thing going on.
It's interesting the parallels that can be drawn between that opening scene and later in the movie, because when you think about the way that it was sort of structured, the canaries at the beginning are sitting happily in their cage and they're undisturbed, and then it is because of the tension between Melanie and Mitch that she opens up that cage and starts to mess with the bird trying to grab it. And so it's this moment of disruption, and then the bird gets out, it's free, it's outside, and everyone is sort of panicking. And then it settles into that little tip dish, and then Mitch puts his hat on it and catches it. And so the moments of requite for the human characters in the movie reflect those moments of stability for the birds. They're not always being picked up in their cages or disrupted. It's only every moment, and I used this already, but there's sort of a status quo happening where sometimes the humans are messing with the birds, and then it flips, and it's not constantly, but sometimes the birds are messing with the humans, and so there's sort of a give and take.
So you're using that as reasoning as to why the birds aren't attacking constantly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. It's flipping the ecological paradigm of the food chain, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
Humans aren't always hunting and killing to eat, and birds are not always hunting and killing in this flipped version.
Yeah. I just want to talk about that chaotic scene in the town. It starts with the one guy exploding because of all the spilled gasoline.
He throws his match down. Well, he doesn't throw the match down. Rather,
It's the fumes.
match burns his fingers and he drops it.
Oh, is that what happened?
Yeah, so he sees the people yelling, and then you see he sort of throws his hand up in the air. And I took that to mean that the match had reached his fingers, and so it burned and that's why he dropped it.
Oh, I thought it was just like because there was a lot of gasoline. I thought it was just like the fumes that caught. Yeah, that makes a little more sense. So he explodes, and then there's fire. Everything's on fire, and there's birds everywhere. And then Melanie gets trapped in that phone booth, and there's the image of all the birds superimposed over every shot of the town. So it's supposed to be this like hellish chaos that's going on. I like that scene, but it just gets a little bit cheesy with like the number of things that happen. Also, the way in which that scene and the effects of that scene have been dated makes it seem really cheesy to the modern viewer.
Yeah, it was a little crazy, but I do feel like it was sort of building to it as the moments in the movie were getting sort of progressively more and more erratic and a little bit more disruptive. And so it does sort of peak with that. That being said, it didn't feel climactic, right?
No, I
Even
wouldn't
though
say so.
it should be.
Whether it's literature or like a movie or something, the climax should give you an idea of how it might end.
Yeah.
And this doesn't.
I wonder, though, if that scene would have been more powerful if it had a score under it. I wonder if it would have felt more climactic if it had been scored.
A lot of these moments in the movie, you just get ambient bird noises going on in the background. And in the pet store in the very beginning, I couldn't hear what the dialogue was because of all these bird noises. So I had to really like strain to hear that opening dialogue in the first scene. I think that was intentional. And then the same thing in that scene that we're just talking about. I think that's supposed to add to the chaos of it.
Yeah.
I mean, music would also add to the chaos, but I feel like that would then take away from the overwhelming presence that the birds have in that scene.
Yeah, because there was a lot to the sound design of this particular movie in regards to when the bird noises were used. And even more than that, every moment of the film, it's sort of built around these moments of very specific audio cues. Like when she's getting into the boat, there's no sound. And I feel like typically a movie would give some sort of interlude over that where you wouldn't be hearing the boat motor and you wouldn't be hearing the rowing and the sound of the water and the birds. You would just be hearing some sort of like incidental scoring to pass the time. And there's something that is eerily tense about that boat moment very early on that shouldn't have any tension to it.
When it's weird to see that kind of thing happening in a movie that's after Psycho, because Psycho does it so well. And then there's this. For whatever reason, Hitchcock decided that the tension in this movie was going to come from the sound effects rather than the score.
Well, apparently it was Bernard Herrmann's idea to not use music.
Really?
Yeah, Bernard Herrmann advised them to not use music. And for those of you who have listened to our previous podcasts would know, Bernard Herrmann was one of the people that is largely responsible for the way that film scores are still created, and he was the film score for Psycho. You know, I wonder, did he just not want to do this movie?
Maybe he was busy with some other job.
Or he was just burnt out. I mean, being a film composer and being a film composer of his quality, I would assume is incredibly tiring and stressful to do.
Maybe he was just like, Al, really? Birds? Is that what we're doing now? Birds? I'm not doing it.
He just uses the seagull effect just constantly on the cello.
Oh yeah, I love that effect. That's a great effect.
I do too. It's so funny that they basically said don't do music for this, and it's fine. Because I feel like it would have helped. I feel like there are a couple of moments, not a whole lot of moments, but there are definitely a couple of moments where it would have done something.
Yeah, definitely in the beginning. Like there's just so much setup in this movie. For some reason, I feel like music would have made it go faster and go smoother. Because music can, and any sound design can be more than just background. It can be transitional. It can be functional, like it was in Psycho with the stabbings. In some moments in this, it's a missed opportunity not to. Especially like transitionally, that could have been when she's driving and you just hear the screeching tires when she's on the boat. But I do wonder if maybe they made that choice because they wanted to juxtapose the peace of the silence earlier in the movie with the constant bird noise chaos later on.
Yeah.
Do you think
Makes sense.
Do you think that's what Bernard Herrmann was thinking?
I mean, hopefully. I can't really say for sure. I think that it's difficult to say. The bird noises, of course, are incredible and very potently used. Like you said, the end scene where they're just sitting in silence and the only thing you can hear is the rising of the birds. That is incredibly powerful to just hear that be the scoring of the tension of the film. But other than that, who's to say whether it would have benefited more with it than it did without it. So
yeah, and maybe it's because we're musicians, but I feel like if people can watch this movie and notice that there's no music in it, then there should have been music in it.
Mm-hmm.
That's just my feeling.
It's different than a movie like A Quiet Place, which is largely unscored. Just sort of have it be absent altogether, it really changes the sensation that one has while watching. There also could have been some interesting work done with starting the film with a score and then over the course of the movie have the score be replaced by the bird sounds. If I were scoring this movie, the beginning, all orchestra score, classic Bernard Herrmann work, and then, you hit that like halfway point and then all of a sudden it starts shifting towards purely electronic bird sound and then ending with just birds.
I completely agree.
Transformative, really.
Yeah, for sure.
And I'm not just saying that because it would have given us another opportunity to have a Bernard Herrmann score outside of the masterpieces that are Vertigo and Psycho, but because I do think that it would have more aptly underscored the tones that we're supposed to be sensing throughout the movie. Because if you didn't know what The Birds was about when you started watching, if you had no clue, it feels very much like it could be a romance film, akin to something like The Proposal. The Sandra Bullock movie where she is the boss at a printing agency and she doesn't get along with one of her workers and then they fall in love over time on like the middle of like a house on an island. So it's like the same process, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those things where it's just like this movie has all of the tone of a normal, pleasant, sort of slow burn romance up until the moment where she gets attacked in the boat. And then the tone immediately changes. And we sort of know and understand that something is up and that this is an Alfred Hitchcock movie and that we should be expecting an Alfred Hitchcock movie.
Yeah, so I somewhat disagree with that. I agree that the tone changes when the bird first strikes her, but up until that moment, I don't see it as a romance movie. I felt like there's something sinister going on from the moment she looks at Mitch after he leaves the pet store and she's like, I'm going to follow him. And it just felt like there's something sinister going on, but I feel like the tone changes or the focus shifts to the birds when it hits her. Originally, you're like, all right, the movie's called The Birds. Here we go. This is the real conflict here. Because it just feels like really creepy and sleazy when she's pulling off this convoluted plan.
Yeah, it feels very much to me like, to be honest, it feels like the classic 1960s enemies to lovers kind of movie. And the fact that Richard Deacon is in it.
Wasn't that the guy who is his neighbor?
Yeah, he was the neighbor, and he played Mel Cooley in the Dick Van Dyke Show. Yeah. And he was in Leave It to Beaver, and he was also in another animal horror movie called Piranha. But he's largely, I would say, a comedic actor. I mean, I know he has dramatic roles and such, but I largely know him as a comedic actor. And so that, for me, I was just like trying to suspend the idea that I've seen this before. And I was like, this is like it very clearly trying to set up some strange, mysterious romance where the two main characters don't like each other. And then through a series of events, they fall madly in love, which I suppose you could read this movie as a romance movie anyway, based on the relationship that they develop over the course of it.
Oh, absolutely. It has romance and, I think, humor elements to it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, like the first fourth of the movie kind of has that. It's like the beginning of the romance, but still kind of creepy in my opinion. But also there are those humorous elements. Like, for example, when Melanie first gets to Bodega Bay and she's at the convenience store, and the guy behind the counter, she's like asking questions about the Brenners, and she asks Mitch's sister's name. She's like, "Okay, do you know what his sister's name?" And he goes, "It's Alice. It's definitely Alice." And then but then he asks the guy in the back, and he goes, "What's the Brenner girl's name?" And he goes, "Lois." And they like go back and forth. He goes, "No, I'm pretty sure it's Alice." So it's like, why did he ask him in the first place? But then it ends up being neither of those. It's Kathy, which is not even close to Alice or Lois. So I feel like there's supposed to be this kind of humor behind
good humorness to it.
Yeah.
For sure. But do you think that your idea of sort of the creepy tone to it would have been at all impacted by when she's on the shore in Bodega Bay, they had just like a nice, lively, underscored sea shanty? Or if her walking down the street had Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue?
Yeah.
I think that that in that case, like, a lot of the creepiness might be a product of that lack of a score.
I completely agree. If they would have had some background music that wasn't creepy in any way, that was a little bit more upbeat and jaunty, then I wouldn't have felt that way at all. I would have been like, oh, well, she's just doing some lighthearted prank that she kind of portrayed as always being up to.
Yeah, it's interesting that he portrays her as this sort of prankster, which she vehemently defends herself against. But also the entire nature of their relationship is dependent on her trying to pull a prank.
Terribly also. Because she puts so much work into it, and she develops this whole plan, and she writes this letter to Kathy, and has this whole thing with the boat, and sneaks up, and then she leaves that note and everything, and then she just starts paddling the boat away, but then she stops and watches. It's almost as if she wanted Mitch to notice that she did that.
Oh, she absolutely wanted Mitch to notice.
So I see her not so much as like a prankster, but more of like a professional manipulator. First of all, she gets the lady at the pet store to overnight these lovebirds. I feel like your bird supplier probably doesn't make daily...
Can't churn them out that fast.
Yeah, they probably don't make daily deliveries to your pet store. Especially not in 1963. And then she gets Mitch's neighbor in San Francisco to tell her all about how to get to Bodega Bay. And then the man at the general store, she kind of manipulates him into not only telling her all about the Brenners, but also he then offers to get her a boat after they have their conversation. And then she also manipulates Annie into basically convincing people that they know each other and to rent her that room in her house. She eventually does manipulate Lydia, Mitch's mom, into accepting her as Mitch's love interest.
Right.
I don't think that was active manipulation. It just ended up being like kind of incidental.
Yeah. It's interesting, too, that she wrote a letter to Mitch for the Lovebirds, and then she tore up the letter to Mitch when she rewrote them for Kathy, because I don't think that she believed Kathy was real.
So, do you think that she just thought Mitch was, like, flirting with her?
I do, actually. And the reason I think that is because when she goes to the department store in Bodega Bay, just like you're saying, she asks about Mitch, and she specifically asks who Mitch lives with, and the guy that's running it says his mother and the girl, and she says, the girl? And he says, yeah, the younger sister.
Well, isn't it? It's Mrs. Brenner and the girl. And then she goes, Mrs.
Brenner
Mrs.
and the girl.
Brenner, because she then thinks, oh, he's married. But it's his mom.
Oh, maybe that's what it was. I was reading it like she wasn't, like she didn't think that the daughter was real. That's probably more accurate.
I mean, maybe, but I didn't see it that way.
I don't know. It's hard to tell how much of it is prank or manipulation and for what purpose.
Their whole relationship, like we said, it starts based on this elaborate prank and starts with them like manipulating each other the whole way. And then you do kind of get this flirtatiousness once they kind of get to know each other in Bodega Bay. And they, after she gets attacked by the bird, they sit down in the restaurant together and kind of chat. And it's very clear that they're into each other. But then there's this like really sudden shift where they walk back into the house at some point and arm in arm and they have a kiss.
It's when she says that she's going to make tea for the mom because the mom just got back from seeing the one dead body.
Yeah. And it's just like this sudden shift in the relationship. Like, I guess we're on to the next level, even though it's been literally a day. Mm-hmm. Aside from that happening, there isn't really any reason for them to be beyond their flirtatious beginning of that relationship. It just felt like a very sudden, okay, something's happened, but we didn't see it kind of idea.
Yeah, I mean, this movie that's sort of a lot of it.
It is what it is. Like, it's there, and it's related to other things that are going on, but I feel like they kind of beat you over the head with it pretty constantly until the birds actually start actively and aggressively attacking everyone.
I mean, speaking of which, this movie fails the shit out of the Bechdel test.
Yeah.
Which, for those of you who do not know, the Bechdel test is a theoretical test that was actually created by a comic designer, which states essentially three things. That for a movie to pass, it needs to have one, at least two women in it, two, who talk to each other, and three, about something other than a man. And a large portion of movies do not pass that. And I think that this movie was sort of doomed to fail, particularly because of the way that they have Melanie Daniels and Annie Hayworth interact. Like, their entire impetus for even being there is reduced to lusting for Mitch. That being said, there is an interesting argument that I read while doing some research for this that claims that this movie is exceptionally feminist. Apparently, Camille Paglia, who is an American feminist academic and social critic that was a professor at the University of Arts in Philadelphia, said that this movie is an ode to the many facets of female sexuality, and by extension, nature itself. And she specifically talks about the roles of all of the women in the film and how Mitch is entirely defined by his relationship to those women, which I think is sort of an interesting way to look at it. And it's very similar, in my opinion, to something that we talked about with Rear Window, where all of the women in Rear Window are exceptional. They are outstanding in what they are doing, whether they be artists or the socialite or the sort of matron, the nurse, and they are braver and they are going to believe everything that's going on, and you know, they work to solve the mystery as much as Jeff did. And I don't believe that this movie necessarily has the same sensation of female importance or independence, especially because there are a remarkable number of women in this movie, with Lydia, Melanie, Annie, Kathy, and the woman who's the expert on the birds. It shows that they have potential to be anything, and they really are pivotal to this movie. But yeah, there's something unsettling about the fact that they essentially created the character of Annie Hayworth to be entirely defined by her relationship to Mitch, so much so that she can't even leave Bodega Bay, where she had to become a teacher because she came there to be with him.
Yeah, I don't think that Alfred Hitchcock set out to make these strong female characters in the name of feminism. I think that he's just exceptional at characterization. And I think that then the feminist kind of ideologies then come out of that. Because as weird as it sounds, he sees women as people, and people make good characters.
Yeah, complex individuals capable of intricate thought and personalities.
And that's the great thing about his characterization, is that it produces these highly dimensional women that then are, it's refreshing, I'm sure, to women who are watching older film, That's like, oh yeah, the woman's not just the up on a pedestal love interest trophy idea. They're playing an active role in the plot. They're providing solutions to the problems in the conflict. So I don't think it was for the purpose of feminism, because 1963, well, I guess it was kind of the women's rights movement, but I don't think that it was like our modern view of feminism. It was just they're people. They're people too. And that's at the core of it what the women's rights movement was about as well. Annie, I think she does function a little bit more than just like the previous love interest of Mitch and the school teacher. I think she also is the premonition seeing character, because she's really suspicious of the birds early on. There's Melanie tells her about how the bird attacked her, and then there's the bird that slams into her door and dies. And then there's the third thing that happens, and she goes, that's 3 now. And it's like kind of before anyone was really suspicious of the birds, and everyone was kind of denying the intelligence of the birds. And she's kind of like an alarmist almost, but she was right. And then she dies. That's a horror element in that, the person sometimes who is right about the danger ends up being a victim of the danger. And it's kind of this horror of the lack of justice. Just because you're right about it doesn't mean that you're immune to the danger of it.
Well, too, you gotta think her death was largely sacrificial. She died protecting Kathy.
Right. Hey, that's important too. That alone proves that she's more than just a previous love of Mitch's.
Yeah, it's interesting though, because how did she die while protecting Kathy? But also, she was like steps away from her house. I just feel she could have done it. She could have made it. She'd have been fine.
I imagine that she was like shielding Kathy with her body. Like she was shielding her from the birds with her body, and then the birds took her down and focused on her while Kathy ran into her house.
And Kathy didn't want to get like a broom or a dustpan or something and just start swatting. I mean, really, who's at fault here? Are we going to blame Annie for her lack of conviction to live, or are we going to blame Kathy for being a little wimp?
Kathy, the child-sized adult.
Well, you know who the actor is that plays Kathy, right?
No, I don't.
It's Veronica Cartwright. Do you want to know what other movie that she was in that's a horror movie that we're going to have to watch eventually that you haven't seen? And I know that for a fact.
Yes.
Alien.
Does she die in Alien?
Yeah, everyone dies in Alien. Haven't you seen... No, you haven't seen Alien. Don't you know anything about Alien? A lot of people die in Alien.
I know Sigourney Weaver doesn't.
Okay, you named one person who didn't die in Alien.
She's the only person I know is in Alien.
Yeah, maybe that's for a reason.
Yeah, I know we have to watch Alien, but I feel like it's justice served that then she dies in Alien, but she gets to survive.
Yeah, well, movie. She's been in other horror movies as well, I think. All of these actors are relatively huge. They've all gone on to have huge careers or had huge careers. Jessica Tandy, Rod Taylor, Tippi Hedren, Suzanne Pleshette, Veronica Cartwright.
Yeah, I don't think Alfred Hitchcock had a problem getting A-listers of the time.
Yeah.
Considering he got Jimmy Stewart and Grace Kelly and Anthony Perkins very early in his career. Although I guess he wasn't an A-lister. I feel like that role probably made his career.
Yeah, that was the thing. He could get the best or he could build the best. That makes them sound a little less than human, but you know what I mean. Alfred Hitchcock, especially with Tippi Hedren, this being her first film, this made her a success.
I think she did a great job acting too, despite all the romance quirkiness of it. And I will say, of the 3 Hitchcock movies we have done for this little trilogy here, this one I think I liked the least, just because I've seen Psycho and I know Psycho so well, and it's so iconic, and this one is too. But and I just love Rear Window. Rear Window was one I had never seen before.
Yeah, you're right. I would agree. This is the weakest of the 3.
And that's not to say it's not a good movie.
Yeah.
I think that it does everything that it needs to. There's a whole lot of slogging that happens in the middle of it.
Not to trash Anthony Perkins' children, but it's way better than I'm the Pretty Thing That Lived in the House.
Yeah, of course it is.
It's just as slow.
Yeah, we've watched slow movies before. We watched A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. That was slow, but it didn't feel like this movie. I was checking my watch a little bit sometimes, being like, how long is this inconsequential scene going to last between?
I feel like you would feel differently if all of a sudden you heard her.
Again, that would have moved the time along quicker for me. There's like way too much of, we're going to have this character interact with this character, and then this character is going to act with this character, and there's going to be this relationship between these two characters, and it just never ended. And it's like, when are we going to get the birds? birds. I want more
Right.
birds. Let's talk about the birds. The birds in the birds. I spent a lot of the movie being like, okay, why are these birds scary? I think it's because the natural disaster element of the birds is kind of inescapable for people. That's what makes them scary, but also it's this helplessness that makes the viewer think, what would I do if this were the situation? What would I do if nature itself turned against me and I had to... It's almost like it turns back time to a earlier history in where you have to fend for yourself. You have to scavenge for food in these situations if it were to go like completely off the rails.
It's like that age-old axiom.
It's survival.
Would you rather fight one horse-sized duck or 10 duck-sized horses?
That's the thing is duck-sized horses, I mean, that's the fear of the birds themselves. It's like the whole death by 1,000 paper cuts idea.
Yep, exactly. It's the number is overwhelming.
Right.
Not necessarily the thing itself, but the sheer amount.
I mean, I live in Illinois, and geese are a big thing here, and geese are like the most aggressive bird around.
Yeah, you walk out and you see a skein of geese, you're going to be upset. More likely than you're going to run into a murder of crows or a colony of gulls.
Right, but think about that one bird. It's like, okay, I can take one bird, but thousands of them, like, that are in this movie or, like, that are in this story. And as someone who is not a fan of birds, I don't find it to be scary, but it is this kind of impending feeling. And I can see why baby boomers were kind of scarred by this as children.
Yeah, if I was going to fight a parliament of owls, I would want it to be a battle of wit, not a battle of fists.
And would you have Mitch Bretner defend you?
I don't think that he could. Maybe against a Vatican of cardinals. I think I could fend for myself. Owls aren't that smart. They just have long legs. But yeah, I think I could take a flamboyance of flamingos.
That's not what it's called.
It is what it's called.
Really?
Yeah. Did you also know it's called a vein of goldfinches?
I didn't know that. Do you just have a bunch of these?
Yeah, I do. An exaltation of larks.
Okay, that one I knew.
You want to know what a group of cowbirds are called?
I don't even know what cowbirds are.
It's a herd. It's a herd of cowbirds.
Get it? Because it's a cow. I don't like birds. I've been hit by too many birds in my life, so I can kind of relate to...
Hit by?
Yes, hit. We'll have Val explain this on the next episode she's in, but I'll get, like, clipped by their wings sometimes. Since Val and I have lived together, which has been, like, 5 years? I've been hit by 4 birds. They usually clip me in the back of the head. When we were at Universal Studios...
So weird.
We were at this trained animal show. They train these animals for movies. And we're like, oh, cool. Like, we get to see the moves that these trained Hollywood animals have. And this trained hawk hit me in the back of the head.
That's crazy.
It's just startling. It's not like I'm being attacked by the bird. So I feel like a lot of the bird scenes I like is when they're not attacking. In the end, when they're walking in the car and they have the house boarded up, but also when they're at the schoolhouse, or when Melanie's at the schoolhouse and she's sitting out there smoking her cigarette. She's sitting just outside the schoolyard, and you can see the crows gathering behind her, and each time they show a shot behind her, there's a few more crows. And then a few more, and then suddenly it's just hundreds of them.
A lot of crows.
And it's great, because you know where it's going.
Yeah.
Even when they get to that final shot of them, it's like, whoa, that's more crows than I was expecting.
That's a lot of crows. Yeah, they really went all in with the training these different animals to actually do things, which I think is great. I think that that's what makes this movie iconic and is what was so remarkable about this movie when it came out was the fact that, yeah, it had some special effects elements, but at the end of the day, they also had real birds on set that they had trained to do all of these insane things. Like in the scene where the birds are just Harry Pottering down the fireplace.
Yeah, that was a really cool scene too.
Yeah, because when you first look at it, you're like, oh man, these are real birds. And then you sit there for a second and you're like, oh wait, these aren't real birds, because you can see sort of how the visual effect is being done. And then if you look a little closer, you can be like, oh wait, maybe these are real birds, because you can see some of them going behind Mitch, which they wouldn't have been able to do with the way that it was shot. And then it's over sort of time of watching it, you can see that it's sort of this mix of tons and tons of real birds and special effects birds over the top. And so while, yeah, the special effects don't necessarily hold up, this movie does a pretty good job of giving you enough real birds there for it to not feel cheap and outdated.
Yeah, really the only scene where I felt like these aren't real birds was when, in that scene I was talking earlier about, when there's just like chaos going on in the town. You can see that the birds are clearly superimposed over the scene that's going on behind it.
Because it's the same shot of the birds repeating.
Like ambient birds just going like tiled over again and
Now,
again.
some of the birds in that are real as well. When Melanie is in the phone box, some of those birds are real. Some of those birds are actually running into that glass because they've been trained to. But that is a case where there are not enough real birds to outweigh the fact that they're just reusing the same shot.
I feel like the reasoning behind using that superimposed image of the birds was to give you the impression that you're in the midst of the flurry of birds, rather than
Right.
if they had chosen to film a cloud of real or even fake birds that were props, that would have been like you're outside it looking into this cloud of birds that someone is being like attacked in the midst of. I like the reasoning behind it. I just feel like it was this, especially in the modern age of effects, it just felt kind of cheesy because of how dated it is. Really, no other reason.
I would agree.
So this is podcast that I know I've mentioned to you before, but everyone who's listening to this should go and listen to Bad Science. It's one of my favorite podcasts to listen to. They have an episode on the birds.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they talk about how they got the birds to do what they did. It's been like a year since I listened to that episode, so I forget exactly what they say, but go listen to their episode on the birds too, if you enjoyed this movie and enjoyed this episode of our podcast. But yeah, go listen to Bad Science. It's
nice.
A good one. Anyways, have you read the short story?
Not since high school, for sure.
Okay.
But yes, I did read it. I know it's a little bleaker.
Yeah, it's definitely different. Like you said, it's bleaker. And a lot of people interpret it to be the birds representing the paranoia
of the Cold War, right?
Of the Cold War, yeah. The whole idea of you never know what's going to happen when. Mm-hmm. Because the whole idea was like, we're going to stockpile nukes and we're going to see what happens.
Sometimes it's a Cuban Missile Crisis. Sometimes it's them birds.
Right. And there is a lot of war imagery in the short story that is not present here. In the short story, they mention, isn't the military going to do something about all these birds? They don't even come to that solution in the movie. They don't even mention that at all.
Yeah, but also, what the hell are the military going to do?
Well, and they do have like fighter plane that attempts to do something to the birds and it crashes because the birds just kamikaze into the plane. There are more global implications. It does seem more apocalyptic, like what you said at the beginning. It takes place in Britain and it's kind of like in the British countryside, and they have a radio and it's like, oh, it's happening in London too, and it's happening all over Europe. So it has more global implication to it. That makes it seem like far more scary. The main character in the short story seems to deduce that the bird's madness is caused by the turning of the tides, and it's timed that way. Was it like every 6 hours? Okay, now the birds are going to attack for 6 hours. Now they're going to be calm for 6 hours. Initially, they thought it was to do with the weather, and I think that's great that we listen to the birds not only the week of Thanksgiving. The turkey is not one of the birds in the birds, but it could have been. This week, we take our vengeance. We kill their brethren and we eat them. The events of this story take place on December 3rd and December 4th.
Just in time for Christmas.
We're just around the corner from that, so I thought it was perfect that we happened to do this now. And I think that in the story, the relentlessness of the birds was conveyed more effectively, just because there was like this, all right, we figured out it has to do with the tides, like we have 6 hours on, 6 hours off, and this is happening constantly, and there doesn't seem to be any sign of it stopping, gave you this more stifling effect that I feel like the movie was getting at. I guess my question out of that is, why did they choose to make it only happening in Bodega Bay?
Right. What's so special?
I think that it has to do with Melanie's presence and her relationship with Mitch and how that affects Lydia.
I mean, that could go along with the sort of tide turning that you were talking about with the book. The idea that it started on this coastal town and has not yet spread outwardly. I think that could be a great explanation that both lines up with your theory regarding Melanie Daniels and the idea of the tides being particularly important to their patterns.
Well, and I think the tide's turning has a lot to do with what's going on in Mitch's life and also Lydia's life, is that she's always talking about how she doesn't have the strength to lose Mitch to a woman, or, since she lost her husband, and she's very afraid of losing Mitch. That would be like it's the tide's turning in her life. In Melanie's conversation with Annie about Lydia, make her seem like she does have this kind of like power over Mitch, but also this power over the women that he chooses to align himself with.
I think that that's a significant theme throughout the entire movie, is the relationship between Mitch and these women.
Yeah, for sure. One thing though, I have to ask you a question.
Yes.
Would you rather have the bird situation, or would you rather have the COVID pandemic?
That is an interesting hypothetical. It's hard to say, because the potential of the birds situation is as global and far-reaching, but as far as we know from both the book and the movie, we don't know the severity of it. So I really don't know. I feel like COVID, and the reason I say that is, it's first of all, it's terrible, and you're making me choose. But I would say COVID, mostly because I think that we're a little bit more well-equipped to develop vaccine and or cure for this disease than developing vaccine and or cure for whatever madness drove the birds crazy. And in that, we do not know what other animals or creatures it would jump to or mutate into changing.
Yeah, I think you chose correctly. As we've come to find out, COVID doesn't affect everyone in a lethal kind of way, whereas the birds could. I had no answer to this. I just agree with you. But wear your masks, people.
Yeah. Thank you all, everyone, for listening to this week's episode of Watch No Evil. This is Matt.
And this is Zach.
And forget everything Disney told you. Do not feed the birds. Repeat, do not feed the birds. I think that's a good sign off, eh?